Hi, and welcome to Your Gov Non-Part, Political Science and Government for Everyone. This is the second in our series on how laws are formed. In our last video, we talked a bit about bills versus resolutions and how bills and some sorts of resolutions become laws and other resolutions do not. Before we get into the really elaborate process by which a bill or a joint resolution passes through the long chain that makes it eventually become a law, we need to touch on another topic, and that is the difference between laws and regulations. Laws, for the most part, we'll say start as a bill. They pass the houses of Congress, they're signed by the president, they're sent to the archivist, they become archived, and they are laid up in the U.S.C, the United States Code, which is the huge group of books that is all the statutes that create our law. And that is technically what a law is. Regulations are issued by agencies. Now, these can be dependent agencies or independent agencies, which we talked about in a previous video. Regulations are used by dependent agencies to carry out or to maintain specificity in the intent of the broader scope of a law. In other words, you have a law, which is a bill passed by Congress, and the regulations by different agencies are used to give those some guidelines and some meaning. However, regulations, telling the difference between a regulation and a law is very difficult because regulations do carry the full force and effect of law. Violation of a regulation will carry some punishment, and therefore you might have some fines or jail time or other serious ramifications, just as breaking a law, violating a regulation. So it's hard to say the difference between a law and a regulation. They are technically, very, very technically different things, but in actual practice they are essentially the same because they both carry the full force and effect of law. Now, regulations are laid up and also in a huge set of books, only this is called the Code of Federal Regulations. It looks a lot like the U.S.C, but it's all regulations. It's the other part of our body of laws. Dependent agencies such as OSHA, which reports to the Department of Labor, or the FDA, which reports to the Department of Health and Human Services, report to cabinet members that report to the executive. They issue regulations on their area of jurisdiction, and in the future we'll do a video or series of videos on jurisdiction, which is another relatively complex concept. But in their area of expertise, they will issue regulations. However, because they are dependent agencies and the top of their chain of command is the executive, their issuance or non-issuance of regulations can, to some degree, be influenced by that branch of the government. Independent agencies are different. They also issue regulations which carry the full force and effect of law and the same penalties and punishments for breaking those regulations, but they do not report to one of the three branches of the government. Now, here's a good example for you to understand that we can probably all relate to, and that's the United States Postal Service. The United States Postal Service is an independent agency. It doesn't report to the executive, it doesn't report to the legislative, and it doesn't report to the judicial branches of the government. It is an independent agency, and yet it does issue regulations. We've all been in a post office and we've seen, the posters that say, here's the list of things that you cannot ship. It's against the law. It's against regulations. It's against Postal Service regulations to ship firearms or flammable fluids or certain types of chemicals. Well, violation of this will carry some punishment. I'm sure you know, and the Postmaster General can lay out fines. He can, I'm sure, lay out some jail time for violation, depending on how serious the violation is, of these regulations. So here you have a situation where a regulation, it's not a law, technically. I mean, somebody out there is going to say, well, you know, regulations are not laws, and technically that's true, but in practice it's not true. Regulations carry the full force and effect of law. So if the Postmaster General says, thou shalt not ship gasoline through the United States Postal Service, and you do it, it's the same as breaking a law. Breaking a regulation is very much the same as breaking a law. So it's important to understand that that is a huge piece of where our body of laws comes from. So you don't necessarily have to have an act of Congress, to use a cliche, to create a law, at least in effect. In technical terms you do, but in practice you don't. The agency can issue it. And a small organization, a small agency such as the Federal Elections Commission only has 6 members. They can issue regulations with those 6 people which have the full force and effect of law, and violation of those regulations of those 6 people can carry penalties. So it's need to understand that our body of laws is not strictly from legislative and executive branch with judicial oversight. However, you must remember that regulations, like laws, are subject to judicial review. There have been regulations, many regulations, which have gone to judicial review and been found, no, you can't do that, it's unconstitutional, or it's in violation of something else, and have been, therefore, overturned. So I hope this helps you understand more of where our body of laws comes from, that it's not just from the passage of legislation, but it's also from regulations issued by agency. And you're going to hear an awful lot in the news these days. We're coming up on a federal election. You're going to hear a lot about regulation, about small businesses being overregulated and whatnot. And those are not necessarily coming from bodies that are under the control of the executive branch or the legislative branch. Those are coming perhaps from independent agencies. The Federal Reserve is an independent agency which issues regulations. So there are about 74 independent agencies that issue regulations which are not under the control, the direct control of the executive or the legislative, or even under the direct control of the judicial. They're only under the potential for judicial review. In other words, this can go to court and be reviewed as to whether it is a legitimate regulation. So hopefully that helps you understand more where our body of laws comes from, the difference between a law and a regulation, and how they are technically different, but they are in practice the same thing. So thank you very much for watching this installment of Your Gov Non-Parts issue on laws and regulations. We hope you might take time to pick subscribe above and join us, follow what we're doing. You can always find us on Facebook, where we do have post things beyond what's on this channel. We'd certainly appreciate it if you could take time to rate the video, either like or dislike if you dislike it. If you have questions or comments, please leave them in the comments section below. We'll do our best to get back to you and answer them as quickly as possible. And as always, thank you for watching.